cabin stood sentinel on the peak of Mount Ethera, a low, sturdy shape of dark timber and riverstone. It was a place built for silence, where the air itself felt thick and velvet soft, insulating the space from the sharper sounds of the world below. Inside, the chamber functioned as a library, its four walls lined from floor to ceiling with books, their spines a faded, comforting tapestry of creams, blues, and forest greens. Tonight, the last light of the day was not a bright, demanding color, but a soft, liquid silver poured slowly and deliberately from the high, narrow window panes. It was the hour known only as the dimming, when the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Elias, the steward of this quiet place, began his nightly task. It was not a difficult task, carrying no sense of urgency or exertion, but rather a meditation of meticulous, unhurried grace. Elias moved across the wide, worn cedar floorboards with steps so light they made no audible sound at all, only a sensation of warm air being gently displaced, a subtle shift in the room's deep stillness. The floorboards, polished smooth by decades of quiet motion, accepted his weight like a deep sigh. He wore soft, thick felt slippers, and each movement was an exercise in lessening sound, a silent promise to the tranquility of the chamber. He reached the first of the tall, imposing shelves, running his hand along the aged wood. The wood was cool and smooth beneath his touch, carrying the faint, dry scent of old paper and mountain juniper. Elias began to return the handful of books that had been consulted during the day. He handled them as if they were fragile, dreaming birds. Each book was settled back into its designated space with the gentlest possible pressure. No snap of the spine, no abrupt thud of covers hitting wood. It was a smooth, silent push, like a boat gliding into a harbor woven from shadows and dust. Elias never looked at the titles, not really. Their names were woven into the deeper fabric of his mind. The Quiet Weaver, the Long Pause, the Geometry of Peace, and the Slowest Clock in the Valley. To read them was to rest the mind, to return them was to rest the world. He paused at the fireplace, a towering construction of riverstone where a faint, steady warmth lingered. The embers beneath a layer of a white ash were the color of faded rose petals, sending occasional lazy curls of smoke up the dark chimney throat. This residual heat was enough to prevent the mountain chill from settling too deep into the bones of the cabin, maintaining a perfect ambient temperature that encouraged stillness. The shadows that spilled from the hearth were not menacing, but hazy and benevolent, stretching and retreating across the ceiling in a dance so slow it was nearly imperceptible. The ritual continued with the shelves opposite the hearth. These held the heavy folios, bound in dark leather that had softened over generations. Elias took the time to wipe a speck of the dust from one cover, a deep burgundy volume titled The Collected Works of Minor Silences. He did so not quickly, but with a single slow brush of his thumb, absorbing the tactile sense of the grain of the leather. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up slightly. It was not a whistle or a howl, but a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh against the thick cedar logs in the chimney opening, a constant whoosh that only served to magnify the deep internal quiet of the library. It was a sound that told the listener, "You are safe. The noise is far away." Elias moved the ladder, a lightweight, carefully balanced piece of wood, along the length of the south wall. The brass wheels beneath the ladder did not scrape. They whispered, a low, metallic hum that was immediately absorbed by the carpet runner below. The ladder came to a stop beside a shelf dedicated entirely to maps of forgotten coastlines. He ran his hand over the rolled parchments, their edges yellowed like antique lace. He paused and closed his eyes. The sense of vertical stillness in the library was profound. All the books, standing upright in their ranks, seemed to be waiting patiently, holding their secrets close. It was a comforting discipline, this vertical order. He retrieved a single small book that lay flat on the top of the shelf, a miniature almanac bound in blue suede. He carried it to his desk, a large, dark wood surface near the western window. The desk was meticulously clean, holding only an inkwell, a small turned-wood paperweight, and a blank leather-bound journal. He opened the almanac slowly, finding the page for the current night. The script was small and faded. It did not contain weather predictions or news, but instead listed the subtle astronomical facts of the hour. The exact time the last sliver of the moon would crest the eastern ridge, the minute the star called Nox Aeterna would become visible, and the atmospheric pressure in pascals of peace. He spent a long, measured moment absorbing these gentle numbers, letting the calm certainty of the celestial clock quiet of the soft murmur of his thoughts. The time had come for the illumination. Elias carefully set the almanac down and reached for the small brass oil lamp. The brass was cool to his touch, its surface polished by his nightly care until it held the faint, diffused reflection of the room's fading light. He took his time, placing a single hand-twisted cotton wick into the clear, amber-colored oil. The wick was dense, absorbing the fuel slowly, without haste. When he finally struck the match, a thin wooden stick from a box that smelled faintly of a mountain cedar. It was not a jarring chemical scratch, but a brief, silvery fizz like a whisper of steam. The flame hesitated for a breath, a tiny point of yellow vulnerability, then caught the wick. The flame settled into a deep golden pool, a light that was substantial yet profoundly gentle. It did not aggressively push back the night, but instead offered a soft, yielding boundary. The light spilled slowly over the desk, painting the blank journal and the quiet inkwell in shades of warm amber. This was the final, chosen light. Elias did not immediately begin to read or write. He simply watched the flame. The golden light gathered all the potential sharp edges of the room, the jut of a shelf, the severe corner of a table legs, the ridge of a book spine, and rounded them softly, pulling the severity of form into the embrace of the shadow. The entire room felt close, protected, and incredibly safe, held fast by the thick walls of silent books and the slow, heavy presence of the mountain itself. He ran a single finger over the leather of the desk journal. It was entirely blank. His job was not to fill it with thoughts, but to keep the space free of them. Finally settled into his worn, velvet armchair, situated near the now dark fireplace. The velvet was deep blue, slightly faded in the places where his arms always rested. He pulled a heavy, woven lap blanket, the color of faded indigo and charcoal, over his legs. The wool was thick and heavier than air, a deeply comforting weight that grounded him to the chair in the moment. The mountain air was beginning to carry a subtle, cool sweetness, the scent of petrichor from the nearby pine forest mixed with the dry, clean smell of the old books. He closed his eyes, and with the visual distraction removed, the other senses became clear, precise, and gentle. He began his listening practice, a nightly hunt for the sounds of absolute quiet, the soft, repetitive tick-tick-tick of the brass lamp cooling slightly as the warmth of the oil spread through the metal. It was not a clock's anxious rush, but a slow, gradual release, the distant, barely audible whisper of pine needles outside the window brushed by a soft air current, a sound like someone turning a thin page very far away. The faint, steady whoosh of the wind against the chimney continued, a metronomic rhythm of safety. The slow, rhythmic pulse of his own breath, a soft, consistent in and out, a sound that affirmed presence without demanding attention. There was nothing left to think about in this quiet library, nothing to rush toward, nothing to wait for. The day's brief activities, the few books consulted, the gentle climb, all of it was tucked away, its worries and noises sealed out by the thickness of the mountain air and the soft, steady glow of the lamp. All that remained was the simple, perfect feeling of being completely still in the center of a contained, dark world. Elias let his muscles relax, starting with his shoulders, allowing them to sink and soften into the back of the velvet chair. Then his arms, feeling the comforting, gentle pressure of the blanket on his lap. Finally, his legs, heavy and still, like rooted stones. He allowed his mind to follow the light. The oil was being slowly consumed, and the lamp's golden pool of light grew dimmer, softer, and more diffused with every passing minute. The shadows grew deeper and smoother, absorbing the tension of the room into their soft, black folds until the entire cabin was on the verge of being completely absorbed into the velvet silence of the high mountain night. He took one last, slow, deep breath, holding the peace in his chest before letting it out in a long, quiet exhalation, surrendering fully to the deep, silent rest of the mountain. The lamp gave a final, tiny flicker, and then the darkness was complete, final, and perfectly calm. Elias sat in the velvet stillness. The act of sitting was in this quiet place an act of intentional surrender. The velvet armchair seemed to mold itself to the contours of his body, receiving his weight and the day's gentle weariness without question or resistance. He focused on the texture of the fabric beneath his hands, a soft, deep pile that had been smoothed over many seasons, giving it a cool, buttery feel. He imagined the tiny woven threads, each one holding a particle of the cabin's long history, a collective softness patiently waiting for this moment of rest. The woven lap blanket, the heavy shroud of indigo and charcoal, settled deeper onto his legs. He focused on the distribution of its weight, a gentle, persistent pressure across his thighs and shins. It was a tangible anchor, tethering his body to the chair, grounding his mind to the present moment. He imagined the sheep that provided the wool, grazing slowly on some distant silent meadow, their movements as unhurried and peaceful as the seconds ticking by in this room. The scent of the blanket was faint, clean lanolin mixed with the ghost of old cedar smoke, an aroma that spoke not of excitement, but of endurance and warmth. His gaze drifted to the floorboards, the wide old cedar planks that made up the main floor of the library. They were not smooth or perfectly flat. Time and careful walking had given them a subtle, undulating surface. In the remaining fading light, he could see the intricate grain of the wood, whorls and lines that were like a slow, sleeping river. He watched the last timid sliver of lamplight catch the polished wood, creating a long, elongated crescent of gold that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to shrink back toward the lamp's base. He noticed the air. It was cool and motionless near the window, yet carried the faint, deep warmth from the stones of the chimney, creating a gentle, subtle layering. He let his lungs expand slowly, filling himself with the clean, high mountain air, rich with the low-frequency fragrance of pine resin and dry, aged paper. Breathing became the central quiet event, a slow rise, a long, quiet fall, like the soft, distant rolling of a gentle tide. The small brass lamp continued its work of self-extinction. Elias focused on the flame itself, a perfect teardrop shape of pale gold. It was entirely still, without a flicker or tremor, held steady by the absence of any disruptive draft. It was a point of absolute stillness in the vast gathering dark. He concentrated on the way the light cast the shadows of his own hands upon his lap, making his fingers appear long, graceful, and profoundly quiet. The shadows were no longer hazy. They were becoming thick and velvety. They had swallowed the high shelves completely, leaving the books as merely dark, solid rectangles of deep quiet. The shadows were not empty. They were full of unwritten potential, full of rest. Elias felt the room slowly becoming softer, the angles dulling, the hard lines of day retreating into the peaceful ambiguity of night. He turned his attention to the walls of books. Though they were now largely invisible, he could sense their collective presence, a tremendous protective mass of sleeping words and dormant thoughts. Each book held its breath, waiting for the day to begin again. But for now, they were a great silent barrier against any disturbance. He imagined the smooth, dark leather and the linen bindings lined up side by side, shoulder to shoulder, a great calm company of silent protectors. He reflected on the concept of repetition, the movement of his hand back to his lap, the sound of the wind's low sigh, the rhythmic expansion and contraction of his chest. These were all small, gentle repetitions. The mind, he knew, found comfort in repetition. It was the natural language of the body settling, a way of telling the conscious self, nothing new is happening, nothing must be watched. You are safe to let go. The tick-tick-tick of the lamp's cooling brass was now the most prominent sound, a small, delicate metallic whisper in the great silence. He focused on its slow, steady tempo, allowing the rhythm to sync with the fading pulse of his own alertness. Elias felt the cool touch of the air on the exposed skin of his face. He let his eyes drift closed, slowly and without force, allowing the heavy curtains of his eyelids to fall across his sight. The external light was gone, replaced by the inner shifting light of his resting mind, pale purples and shifting grays that had no meaning and required no interpretation. He turned his focus entirely inward, listening to the final sounds of the mountain settling, the distant low-frequency drone of the wind in the pines, now so subtle it felt like a vibration within the stone foundation of the cabin. It was the sound of the entire mountain breathing slowly, the occasional faint patter on the window glass, a tiny stray drop of condensation from the moss on the roof, a sound immediately absorbed by the stillness, the fainter still ticking of the lamp, its final moments of internal heat escaping into the cooling air. He imagined his muscles releasing their tension one by one, like small, loose knots dissolving in the warm water. He started at his jaw, letting his teeth part just slightly, softening the hinge. He moved to his forehead, smoothing out the tiny lines of worry that had gathered there throughout the day. He worked down to his fingers, imagining them curling just slightly inward, finding their most restful, natural position on the blanket. There was nothing more to be done. The books were shelved, the lamp was lit, the blanket was warm, and the body was still. The mind, finding no more anchors of duty or urgency, began to loosen its hold. The thoughts that drifted through were not insistent questions or memories, but slow, wandering clouds of vague imagery. The texture of the velvet, the cool smoothness of the desk, the heavy weight of the mountain air. These clouds drifted past, gathering no importance, simply moving slowly until they dispersed into the deep velvet dark. He took one final, slow, luxurious breath, feeling the air fill his lungs to their comfortable limit. As he exhaled, long and quiet, he imagined the last thin wisp of golden light from the lamp finally being exhaled into the shadows, completing the transition. The room, the mountain, and Elias were all one, heavy, perfectly quiet mass, waiting patiently for the dawn that was impossibly far away. All that existed was the deep, restorative weight of the present silent moment. Elias sat motionless. The surrender was complete, yet the awareness remained, gentle and undemanding. The weight of the quietude pressed down, not as a burden, but as a comforting, heavy blanket wrapped around the whole cabin. He felt the vast, empty space of the high night surrounding the small, warm sphere of the library. It was a perfect equilibrium, small warmth within enormous, ancient cold. He turned his focus to his breathing rhythm, letting the awareness deepen with each cycle. The intake was a gentle, slow draw, cool and clean, lasting precisely as long as it needed to. The exhale was an effortless release, a soft sigh of surrender that carried away any lingering stiffness or sharp thought. In-breath, gathering, out-breath, releasing. It was a quiet, internal metronome, slower and more precise than any clock. The velvet chair now felt less like furniture and more like a gentle cradle. He allowed his spine to settle fully against the soft, yielding fabric, imagining the small muscles along his back, which had held him upright all day, finally letting go, smoothing themselves out like silk ribbons uncurling from a spool. There was a deep, satisfying sense of sinking, a gradual descent into the plush security of the seat. He ran his mind over the texture of the air itself. It felt aged and rich, not stale, but filled with the slow, low-frequency sense of the room, the dry vanilla note of old paper, the faint mineral scent of the river stones in the chimney, and the clean, distant musk of the deep mountain forest. These scents blended into a perfect, uniform aroma of home and safe enclosure. The thoughts that came now were not problems to be solved, but slow, wandering images with no urgency. They were the slow migration of clouds across the inner eye, vague, pleasant, and utterly harmless. He imagined the patterns in the dark wood grain of the floor, the swirls and knots that had formed over centuries. They were like slow, sleeping rivers, flowing without current, without destination. He followed one particular whirl, tracing its dark circular path with his inner sight, round and round, a hypnotic, repetitive journey that always returned to its gentle beginning. He focused on his hands resting on the blanket, now completely still. He imagined the microscopic texture of the blanket's weave, the tiny parallel lines of the thread, the small, consistent distance between each fiber. It was a perfect geometry of comfort, demanding no analysis, only simple observation of its hot, soft, persistent order. The subtle heaviness of the indigo wool felt like a gentle, non-negotiable anchor. He shifted his attention to the silence outside the cabin. It was not the thin, hollow silence of a vacuum, but a rich, resonant emptiness filled with the promise of unseen nocturnal activity, the slow shift of rock, the deep, quiet growth of roots, the patient presence of the mountain creatures. He allowed the magnitude of the surrounding stillness to flow into the room, equalizing the pressure within his own head, pushing out any final remnants of daytime rush. The last light from the lamp was truly gone now. The darkness was absolute, deep, and final. His eyes, though closed, registered the uniformity of the blackness, a solid, velvety canvas that required nothing of him. This pure absence of light was a release, a complete vacation for the optic nerves, inviting the mind to retreat further inward. The feeling of release deepened. Elias imagined every small ligament and tendon in his body, tiny ropes that had been gently pulled tight throughout the day, becoming slack, soft, and completely unstrung. He felt the heavy, settling weight of his limbs, a comfortable, sleepy paralysis that rooted him firmly in the chair. He concentrated on his feet, imagining them sinking into the soft wool of the slippers and the cedar floor below. He pictured the roots of the mountain beneath the cabin, deep and stable, and felt himself being gently drawn down into the same deep, quiet earth rest. The gentle sounds continued, a lullaby of subtle physics. The single faint creak from a beam overhead, a sound that spoke not of suddenness, but of the slow, infinitesimal settling of the old wood into the night's cold. The muffled whoosh of the wind in the chimney, a soft, repetitive breath that was predictable and thus perfectly safe. Elias focused on his mouth and tongue, letting the muscles in his face become entirely loose. His jaw felt heavy and slack. He focused on the absence of flavor, the absence of speech, the profound rest of the entire apparatus of communication. No thoughts needed to be formed into words. He was dissolving not into chaos, but into the pure, uncritical consciousness of rest. The heavy indigo blanket, the velvet chair, the silent walls of books, the rhythmic breath, these were the final slow anchors. He was moving past thinking, past observing, and into the deep, welcoming warmth of pure, unblemished stillness. There was no beginning, no end, only the long, quiet, unfurling night.
The subtle shift from observing the relaxation to being the relaxation was the critical threshold. Elias realized the thoughts were still present, not like urgent commands, but like small, shimmering particles floating just behind his eyelids. The book I need to read tomorrow. Did I lock the shed? He didn't fight them. Fighting was effort, and effort was the opposite of release. Instead, he treated each thought like a tiny, curious fish in a dark pool. He watched it briefly, noted its shape, a flash of worry, a spike of planning, and then allowed it to swim away, undisturbed. He offered no food, no attention, and they grew scarce, leaving the pool of his mind quiet and dark. The silence in his head became as profound as the silence of the forest outside. His breath became the final, reliable mechanism of the dissolving self. It was no longer something he did. It was something that simply happened. Inhale, a cool, slow expansion that filled the core. Exhale, a warm, effortless sigh that surrendered weight. He tracked the air as it moved. The subtle, dry scent of cedar dust on the intake, the familiar, stale warmth on the release. It was a perfect, self-contained loop, requiring no thought, demanding no participation beyond its simple existence. The sounds of the cabin, the creak, the whoosh, began to synchronize with this rhythm. The world was now a great, slow, single heartbeat, and Elias was nested safely within its center. A pleasant confusion began to set in. The boundary between the velvet chair and his own skin softened. He was unsure where the heavy indigo blanket ended, and the warmth of his own body began. Memory flickered. A scene from childhood, a quiet conversation, a sudden burst of laughter, but these images were fleeting and without emotional charge. They were just light playing on the deep water. This was the beautiful precipice, the hypnagogic state. He was suspended between two worlds, the conscious mind's fortress and the subconscious mind's limitless sea. He held on to the last, thin strand of awareness, not because he needed to, but because he was fascinated by the sheer weightlessness of the sensation. Just a little further, a thought whispered, "Just let go now." He let go. The sense of his body, the chair, the room, it all receded, not with a jolt, but like a tide pulling away from a smooth shore. He was no longer Elias in the cabin. He was simply consciousness, unburdened, floating, and entirely at rest. There was no past, no future, only the vast, quiet now. The silence was no longer the absence of sound, but a rich, heavy presence. The colors behind his eyes shifted from indigo to a comforting, limitless black. There was a sense of infinite space, completely safe, completely familiar, and completely his own. All effort had ceased.